Hello all, welcome to the third edition of the virtual Samvaad talks. Today's talk is on the effect of data localization, regulation, empirical and simulation analysis given by Professor V. Sridhar. Professor Sridhar is a professor at the Center of IT and Public Policy at IIIT-Bangalore. He is easily the most prolific researcher in our faculty by far. Apart from scholarly articles in research journals, his articles have been published for a wider audience in the press and newspapers, Economic Times, Financial Times, to name a few. He is the author of two books, The Telecom Revolution in India, Technology, Regulation and Policy, published in 2012, and The Dynamics of Spectrum Management, Legacy, Technology and Economics, published in 2014, both published by the Oxford University Press. His third book, titled Emerging ICT Policies and Regulations, Roadmap to Digital Economies, was published in 2019 by Springer Nature. He is currently editing a book titled Data-Centric Living, Algorithms, Digitization and Regulation, which is to be published by Routledge. In addition to his wide teaching experiences across courses and across geographies in the USA, Finland, New Zealand, and India, he has deep research interests in the areas of telecom regulation and policy and information privacy. He has received funding from different sources, both national and international, for his research projects, recent ones being from Facebook and Asim Premji University Research Foundation. He has been a member of the Government of India committees on telecom and IT and has published widely in many peer-reviewed articles in both telecom and information systems journals. After you, Sridhar, for your talk.
Thanks, Professor Jaya, for your generous introduction. I don't know whether I deserve it or not. Let me just share the screen and then go to the presentation. Thanks to the external audience who have joined. I think Professor Santanu has joined from XLRI and someone else have joined. And also Amol from Cuts International, with whom I have worked quite a bit. Let us start the presentation. The topic is data localization regulation, empirical and simulation analysis. So don't be bothered about my background. It's not real background, it's virtual background. I don't have that many books to showcase anyway. So this is basically this picture. This is actually taken from Professor Daniel Soloway of George Washington University Law School, whom I admire quite a bit, and he has done quite a bit of work with respect to privacy and data localization. So this picture basically describes, what data localization is all about, right? So this is, maybe in, some jungle in Africa, and these people want to use Facebook, and Facebook has to put these servers in their particular location. And there may not be electricity, but they have to put up with that. That is data localization, right? So let me give you the context, apart from that particular cartoon. India's Personal Data Protection Bill is yet to be enacted. It has to be tabled in the Parliament. But it mentions that only critical data may need to be housed in India, but critical data has to be housed in India. So some data which is defined as, some personal data which is defined as a critical data needs to be housed in India, which means that it has to be placed in servers within the territorial jurisdiction of India, and that is described in the Personal Data Protection Bill. And there has been a lot of debates all around the world about this particular aspect of data localization. Barring the free flow of data across borders, according to Pichai, is not good, because the global companies contribute to India's economy. You cannot really force Google or Facebook to host their data within India. Of course, obviously, of the Indian residents and Indian citizens to be located within India, because we work globally. Our global servers are spread throughout the world. It is very difficult for us to compartmentalize these data of Indian residents and then host it specifically within India. On the other hand, even you must have heard about the EU General Data Protection Regulation. The EU GDPR also has criticized India on this particular aspect of data localization, which is in the Personal Data Protection Bill. The European Union says that the data localization requirements proposed by India are unnecessary, harmful, and likely to have negative effect on digital trade. Okay, so in general, most of the neoclassical economists believe that free flow of data, free flow of goods and services, free flow of people are required in order to have healthy trade across countries. And we know that some countries do not really adhere to it. India adheres to it to some extent, and that is the focus of this particular talk. But as you are probably aware, COVID-19 has changed things quite a bit all around the world, including data localization. For example, Chinese authorities, and all of you probably know that China has the Great Firewall, which prohibits certain types of data flow across countries from within and into China. And they are even considering, after the COVID-19 crisis, of exploring less restrictive data localization measures. So far, China ranks the highest in terms of data localization measures, strictest in terms of data localization. Even they are thinking of loosening up certain grip over the data localization. So this is the classic work which was done, a couple of years back on the Digital Trade Restrictiveness Index. It, of course, looks at various measures, one of which is data localization. The other measures include economic and trade restrictions and so on. But if you look at this particular index, we can see that China ranks very highest along with Russia as being very, very strict in terms of data restrictiveness, that is restriction to cross-border data flow. Turkey is obviously one of the highest. I don't know exactly why Turkey is there, but Turkey is there as one of the top 3 countries with respect to strictest form of data localization. And here you have India. India is not really bad. It's the global trade, data localization restriction is measured on 0.31, along with Italy, Great Britain, some of the other European countries, including Finland. And if you look at the less restrictive data localization regimes, obviously US is present and some of the Nordic countries are present. And this is the way, by which the countries have adopted data localization measures, ranging from very strict form of data localization to very loose form of data localization restrictions. Okay, so this is the context, and that is put on very, very succinctly by this professor of law at Vijay University in Netherlands, Kuhner. So he basically says that this data nationalism, as we call it, is not just a short-term political phenomenon, but it has long history. It dates back to 1970s in the US. He also says that lack of certainty on the part of society as to whether we want national borders created into the online space. He questions this particular ambivalence with respect to people who use cyberspace, right? So do they want national barriers to be erected or not? That is a big question mark that is to be answered. So the regulation, so that is the context. So most of the countries are moving towards something called as data nationalism, erecting barriers to data flow. If you look at regulations have also caught up with these sentiments. Suppose, for example, you take EU GDPR, it has something called as adequacy rules, right? So what adequacy rules says is that there are certain countries which EU and member countries recognize through which the data flow can happen as if it is within the EU member countries. But for data flow to occur, countries other than this, then they have to meet certain adequacy norms, right? It should be according to contractual conditions. it has to meet all the requirements of GDPR. They have to have privacy and data protection law implemented, and so on. So if you look at these countries, these are all very, countries. I mean, we wonder why these countries are there. For example, Andorra, Faroe Islands, Guernsey, and so on, right? But even if you look at United States of America, US, it says that it is limited to the Privacy Shield framework, which means that the data flow between EU member countries and United States is not without restriction. It is limited to this particular framework, right? One of the main reasons is that US does not have a nationwide, the pan-nation data protection act. So India is not there, obviously, because we are yet to have a Personal Data Protection Act. And we have to make sure that we meet all the adequacy norms of the EU before we get into this particular list, right? So it is very restrictive. If you look at it, the EU GDPR is quite restrictive in terms of data flow across countries. And we have discussed briefly about the India Personal Data Protection Bill. India Data Protection Bill says that, for example, it requires at least one serving copy of the personal sensitive data. Personal sensitive data includes health records, your unique identification details, biometric data, and so on. These have to have at least one serving copy, right? At least one serving copy, which means that there can be a mirror. I mean, the actual copy, the original copy can lie elsewhere, but there has to be at least one mirror copy within the server located in India. It also goes on to say that the state, the government shall further define a subset of personal data called critical personal data, and this has to be processed in server located within India and India only, right? So which means that if the state decides that certain data, such as your password, is considered as a critical personal data, then the password has to be stored in a server which is located in India only. Of course, we are glad to know that the critical personal data is yet to be defined by the government, right? But when it decides what is critical personal data, then all the companies have to adhere to this particular statement, right? So this is the form of data localization that is taking according to different kinds of regulation. So here is the picture, which basically illustrates and sort of puts the overall perspective on what is cross-border data flow and what we mean by data localization regime, right? So in countries where there is no restriction, right, or minimal restriction, then there is unconditional transfer of data across the countries. But if there is data localization restriction, then it can be less restrictive or it can be highly restrictive. For example, in countries like China, it is very highly restrictive. In India, you might say that it is less restrictive because not all the data has to be stored within India and India only. Only mirror data and some segmented data has to be stored within the country. So this is less restrictive and this is highly restrictive. And this less restrictive will lead to, for example, conditional data. The flow across the countries have to meet certain conditions. Whereas in the case of highly restrictive, there is complete ban on the flow of data across the countries, which meaning that no data can exit out of the country. So this is the relationship between data localization regulation and its effect on the cross-border data flow. Okay. So what have we done, right? That's more important. So we basically the first first portion of the analysis is going to be on an empirical analysis of the transporter data flow. Actually, I started it sometime in 2016, and the project was supported by the South Asian Network of Economic Institutions, and we have done some work with respect to that. So to give you the context, the trade between countries, right? The trade between India and US or India and Europe or India and China. I mean, all these trade between the countries, as classical economists would say, depends upon stock, that is, amount of capital that you have in the country and the amount of labor that you have. But there are enhancements which have been made. This particular function, which takes into account the economies of the country and the stock of capital and labor is normally known as Cobb-Douglas production function. But trade economists have enhanced this to include flow, right? So what is flow? Flow is the flow between countries, right? So there can be flow of goods, there can be flow of services, there can be flow of finance, there can be flow of people, like for example, leading to migration. There can be flow of digital data as well. You know, for example, there can be phone calls, there can be internet traffic. All these flows between the countries also lead, along with the stock, is going to be affecting the economic development. There was a classic study by McKinsey Global Institute in 2014 and for the subsequently in 2016, which basically captures most of these factors. Right. So my work is in this particular part of the work is closely borrows from the work of the MGI. So what we have done in this particular work is to take the stock into the Cobb-Douglas production function and some flows, not all flows, because it's very difficult to get data for some of these things. For example, digital. How much is telephone calls is available from International Telecommunications Union? What is the amount of internet traffic across countries is very difficult to measure, right? And therefore, we have broken up goods and services into two categories. One is the goods, which are ICT, right? So we would assume that most of the ICT goods involve transfer of bits and bytes, and the services can also be ICT services, much like the IT-enabled services, IT services that our country performs, right? And most of it involves data flow across countries. So we have broken the goods and services into ICT goods and ICT services and non-ICT goods, that is other goods and other services, and then put it into the Cobb-Douglas production function. One is, how do we measure the flow? The flow can be exports, that is the flow which goes out of the country, or imports, that is flow which is coming into the country. So we have taken both the exports and imports, and then we have computed what is called as net exports as a proxy measure for the flow between countries. So if you look at it, this picture gives some idea about how, for example, global exports is just a measure of global exports of total services and global exports of ICT services. You can see that, for example, India is dark. ICT services exports, ICT services very high in India, right? It's more than 100, it's close to $100 billion now. And then you can see that, some countries do not have, for example, China. China does not have as much of ICT exports such as India, right? So this is the context in which the empirical analysis has been performed. There is also some amount of work which says that digital adoption, either by businesses or government or personnel, is closely associated with the economic development of the country, right? So if you see increasing pattern with GDP increase, you see increase in the adoption, digital adoption, by people, by government, and by businesses, right? So this is another factor which motivated us to look at, for example, the effect of digitization on economies in the countries. So we built a data repository, getting it from World Trade Organization, UNCTAD, the World Bank, the World Development Indicators, and so on. The final panel data set consists of about 280 countries over a period of 17 years, 2000 to 2017. And the model is basically you analyze whether the GDP of the country, I refers to the country and T refers to the time period. It's a panel data set. How does it depend? I mean, is there any causal relationship, or is there any sort of relationship, right, positive or negative, between the GDP of the countries and fixed stock, as is given by the classical economists, fixed capital and employment ratio, proxying for capital and labor, and then all the flows, right? ICT goods, non-ICT goods, ICT services, non-ICT services, and then we also thought that we would, there is a lot of research evidence which says that the stock, such as mobile subscription density or landline broadband density, has an effect on GDP of the country. So we've included these two variables as well into the economic model. So the country fixed effect model, of course, we check for multicollinearity, and it does not exist. But the significant results show that net exports of ICT goods, apart from the traditional economic variables such as fixed capital, FDI, and then fixed broadband density, has a significant positive effect on the GDP of the country. Right? This we are still, and still it has not yet been published, so we're still working on finding out some of the nuances of this model, verify whether it holds good across all countries, or is there any variation between low income countries versus high income countries. Those are some things that we need to do at this point of time. Okay, so that is the first piece of work, which is basically looking at whether the data of the flow, right, especially the ICT flows, ICT goods and ICT services flow across countries has an effect on the GDP or economics of the country, different countries or not. Okay? So this is the first piece of work. The second one is regulation. So we wanted to find out what the stakeholders' viewpoints are with respect to this data localization regime, right? So we know that cross-country data flows are good. Cross-border data flows seem to be good. At least ICT goods seem to have a good impact on, for example, the GDP of the country. So the next question is, what are the stakeholders' viewpoints are? So it is a joint work with CUTS International Jaipur. I think Amol and Uday probably are there in the call. Thanks to CUTS for involving me in this particular discussion. So what we did was we basically put a taxonomy of the various stakeholders. The various stakeholders in this game include the data subjects like you and me, the data fiduciaries, that is the companies which collect data and process data and then disseminate data, and then of course the government or the state. Right? So if you look at these the viewpoint, I mean, if you look at, for example, from the viewpoints of these different stakeholders, there are a lot of variables. So for example, data subjects, they are worried about consumer welfare. Am I getting a good quality service at the price that they want, right? Are there any innovative features that are provided by these services? At the same time, they are worried about surveillance, right? So if, for example, the data localization restricts data to be stored within the country, will the government surveil on me? If the data is located elsewhere, will the firm that is storing the data surveil on me, right? Is the surveillance by foreign governments or foreign fiduciaries or by local governments? Is it going to be present and it is harmful for me, right? If the data localization is present, am I worried about freedom of expression, right? And censorship by the state, because they can have more control over what data is being transmitted and transferred. From the point of view of data fiduciaries include, for example, Facebooks and Googles of the world. They worry a little bit about cost of service, right? So, for example, if data localization is present, it might increase. All of them actually, if you know that we have a very stringent data localization policy with respect to financial data, right? So, RBI in its notice, which was sent on 2018, has stipulated that all financial data transactions have to be stored in a server located within India only, right? As soon as this was announced, there was a huge, hue and cry from the foreign multinationals, including Google Pay and Amazon Pay. So they say that my cost of service for providing this payment service to Indian citizens will go up tremendously, and therefore because of the cost of compliance, right? And we have to put a separate server here, build a separate storage, and that will increase the cost. On the other hand, local companies were exuberant, right? Jay Shekhar Sharma of Paytm basically said that this is an excellent step. This will actually promote Make in India, right? So there can be economic spillovers, like for example, local startups may be able to leverage the data localization regime to their advantage. On the other hand, the foreign multinationals might crib, saying that the cost of service has gone up. And we may not be able to provide all services. The quality of service is going to deteriorate. You don't have, for example, reliable power supply and bandwidth in India. So if we put our servers within India, then our quality is going to suffer. Right? So these are all the possible responses from the data fiduciaries. From the government and state, the nationalism, data nationalism kicks in here. Right? So the state says that I want to have the lawful interception of the data, right? So that in case of emergencies, I can actually get it. right? For example, as you are probably aware, we have in Bangalore itself more than 10,000 cases of cybercrime, right? But unfortunately, most of the origins of these perpetrators lie outside India. And unfortunately, the Bangalore police has jurisdiction only within the city of Bangalore in order to take any action. So if the perpetrator of the crime lies outside their territorial jurisdiction, they cannot really take any action. And therefore, these are pending cases, right? Pending cases for a long time because there is no solution yet. The perpetrator is outside India. And therefore, from the government and state point of view, it is good to have data located within India so that any fraud or any lawful interception can be taken, can be undertaken. They can also say that there is proactive intelligence so that terrorism and things like that can be stopped. We can stop fake news. We can, things like that. But it can also be used for other purposes, such as, for example, promoting national interest, promoting political propaganda, and so on. So this is quite a complex game involving so many variables, right? So I'll come back and discuss, what variables we can handle. So in collaboration with CUTS International, we did an expert survey, basically conducted a Delphi kind of survey where we invited experts in the field of data localization from firms which offer digital services, and then tried to find out what their viewpoints is. Right? As expected, most of them say that there is an enhancement to the social good, societal good, which is improving national security, improving economic development, improves law enforcement agencies' access to data. But there is also an increased risk, right? Because there will be reduction in service attributes such as increase in price, reduction in quality of service. There will be more data breaches and cyber attacks if the data is located within the territorial jurisdiction, and so on. So this is what experts said. Then we went ahead and then collected responses from close to about 600 to 700 e-commerce users and asked about different types of their perceptions on data localization regime. So they also basically say that, for example, the availability of services will come down, innovation will be, will come down quite a bit. There will be increased risk, right? Increased risk with respect to censorship. Government can censor the data. You must have heard about internet shutdowns, which happened in Jammu and Kashmir. It's possible to do censorship of the data. There will be a lot of privacy violations because the state can actually take the personal data from the local data service with ordering data fiduciaries to disclose them and so on. But they also say that, for example, it may be good for local economic development. It will introduce a lot of competition to global companies. It will lead to economic development of the country as such, and so on, right? So these are all more or less what we expect, right? So in general, people seem to be, both the experts as well as the data subjects seem to concur that it has positives and negatives, right? The negative aspects are morely related to privacy intrusion, state control, the deterioration in quality of service, increase in price of service, lessen competition, and so on. Whereas the positive aspects include local economic development. It is possible to have more startups in that particular space, competing effectively with multinationals, and so on. Right? So this is the broad overview. So, but unfortunately, this actually one of my students, Indonesian students, also did this particular survey in Indonesia to find out, perceived awareness. Are the data subjects aware about their current location of data storage? Do they have preferred location? If you say, for example, most of them will say that they don't really know where the data is stored, but they want the data to be stored within India, right? And this is a very characteristic response that you get from data subjects, right? So, given this context, we wanted to analyze the economic effects of data localization. Here, I would like to really give my grateful thanks to Professor Sridhar, who exposed me to agent-based modeling. I am also, I also thank profusely Sai Rakshit, our IIM student 5th year. I don't know whether he is there in the call or not, to have modeled this and then bring it up to speed. So economic effects of data localization is what we wanted to model. So our model consists of producers and consumers. So these are producers of digital trade, consumers of digital trade. They operate within countries, and the countries have certain regulatory environment. The regulatory environment include no restrictions, less restrictive, and highly restrictive. So I have 10 minutes, I'll finish that, and then after that I'll take questions. The important thing in digital trade is this concept of iceberg, right? This is iceberg, as you can see. So iceberg floats in the northern and southern Arctic regions, but when they float, they actually melt, right? And this holds good for digital trade as well. So if, for example, there is a transaction happening between producers and consumers, and if the producers and consumers are far off, then there is an iceberg cost. There is something which melts on the way, right? Because of theft or because of some other things. And therefore, in general, if the distance between producers and consumers are large, then the producers have to hike the price, right? Hike the price so that this, cost, the iceberg cost, is included in the retail price of the goods and services, right? So that is one thing, we take into account this iceberg cost into our model. The second one is data compliance cost, right? So what is data compliance? You have, for example, the applications which are running, but if you want data localization, then you have to mirror the server, right? When you mirror the server or when you segment the data, you incur additional cost, right? If you don't mirror, then it is possible that you will not incur the cost, but the data localization will not allow you to serve from that particular far off location. They might, in the case of highly restricted countries, it is probably required for the server to be located within the country where the consumer is situated, right? So this is the data compliance cost, which we basically refer to as non-tariff measures. So we take into account these costs into our model. And there is one more thing that I want to deliberate on, right? There are certain, services which basically, the producers themselves, the producers of these digital services, they take every measure to make sure that the content is nearer to the consumer for better quality of experience. One of the excellent examples is Amazon, Netflix Open Connect, right? So the Netflix Open Connect program allows the ISPs to get the Netflix, content directly into their servers, which is located very near to the consumers, right? That is one of the reasons why, for example, in general, the Netflix works very well even in HD mode in most of the even low bandwidth conditions, because there is a server very, very near to you, right? In which the ISP has stored or cached the content, right? So there are certain services which basically do that, right? The model basically looks at a consumer agent and producer agent attributes. The consumers, I don't want to go into the details, but in general, the consumers can be defined of two types. They can be price sensitive or they can be quality sensitive. Price sensitive customers attach more importance to the price and they are less quality conscious, whereas the quality sensitive customers are exactly the opposite, right? Each consumer will have something called as the willingness to pay, taking into account both price and quality. They will buy that particular goods or service if it is within their willingness to pay. That's what exactly it means. Then there are producers. The producers can, their home location can be the same as that of the consumers, or it can be outside. For example, the Google server, which is located in Iceland, is an example of a home location of a producer such as Google, whose server is located very far outside the country of the consumers in India. They also declare certain price and certain quality of their goods and services. They interact with each other in the marketplace, and while during their interaction, there are a lot of adjustments that are made to the prices. For example, if depending upon the, I'm just losing my pen here. I don't know where the pen is. Okay. So the pen is here. The pen goes all over the place, right? So for example, they have to factor in adjustments on price and quality depending upon the type of regulation which is in place, right? So for example, if the regulation requires stricter forms of localization, then they will incur a huge cost compared to, for example, countries which do not require data localization and so on. Then there is the iceberg cost, which has to be included based upon the distance between consumers and producers. Right? So these are the model equations which were built in. to adjust for data localization compliance and gravity model adjusted price, right? The price depends upon beta, which is the iceberg coefficient. If the iceberg coefficient is higher, then the price is higher. For example, most of the financial services, they are required to be placed within, nearer to the customer, so that the privacy and data protection regulations are preserved, in which case beta coefficient will be higher, whereas in the case of social media services, beta coefficient may be lower because it is not very, very price sensitive, personal data sensitive. So we did a number of simulations that I don't want to discuss a lot of detail. So basically we simulated the countries in a rectangular grid, and then we placed the producers and consumers randomly, and then we allowed different types of regulations to be in place, highly restrictive, less restrictive, and more restrictive, and then we have attained some good results. A couple of things that I want to point out. One is this result. For example, in highly restrictive countries, the market share of the local firms and the global firms differ, but not much compared to, for example, in countries with no restriction. In the case of countries with no restriction, clearly the global firms have a very high market share compared to the local firms. The reason is like this, right? In the case of highly restrictive countries, the global firms, that is the firms which are not present in the home location of the consumers, are going to incur a huge compliance cost. Therefore, their price will go up, right? And therefore, the quality will deteriorate. That basically gives an advantage for the local firms to basically offer a competitive offering. I mean, in this particular case, we are assuming a competitive market with no distinction between the goods and services offered by the local firm and the global firm. And therefore, local firms catch up. Whereas in the case of countries with no restriction, it's purely based upon the price and quality combination, in which case global firms actually are far, far higher in terms of their market share compared to, for example, the local firms. So you can see this huge difference. Similarly, the mean distance between consumers and producers, the mean difference between consumers and producers, is higher in the case of countries with no restriction, because in the case of countries with no restriction, the consumers can buy it from multinational producers, and the producers are far off, and the mean distance is very high, and that is especially for services which can potentially be deployed by servers located in other parts of the world. But for example, the services which require, which requires local presence, not because of regulation, but because of the nature of the service. For example, like financial services, the mean distance across highly restrictive and more restrictive regions is almost the same, right? Which means that the local and the global producers will also, for example, they will mirror their services on their own, like the Netflix Open Connect, in order to provide better services. Right? So this is basically the result. So results I have mentioned it. I have about 2 minutes, and then so let's look at policy implications. What does it mean, right? So the policy implications is that economics of digital trade is protection of national security and privacy, right? So there are some possibly good points. For example, the local firms seem to have an advantage in a highly restrictive data localization regime compared to, for example, non-restrictive regime. Therefore, we need to promote it, right? So that is, at the same time, we also that reduces the competition level, and therefore that reduces the the number of options that consumers have, and therefore these have to be taken into account. With respect to regulations, there are some especially with respect to security and data privacy, there are a lot of multilateral and bilateral agreements which have been taking place. So even if the data is located, for example, in the US, if there is a cyber crime which has been perpetrated by, for example, or a financial fraud which has been perpetrated by a criminal who is located in the US, is it possible to bring in some kind of partnership agreement so that the cyber forensics and other things can take place at speed, quickly, right? These are very, very initial stages. Even though we have a cyber law in many countries, the international cyber security sharing and information arrangements is very, very poor, right? It's very, very poor at this point of time. The state, apart from that, the policies also have to address state communication sovereignty. Long time back, Calabres discussed communication sovereignty, right? So, for example, the Arab Spring, the Facebook and the Twitter actually was banned. There was no cross-border data flow because of political reasons, right? For example, India has the longest internet shutdown, close to about 400, more than 400 days or something like that in Jammu and Kashmir. And Professor Janaki knows about that well, right? That's because of political constraints. So there are a lot of political aspects which also come into this data localization regulation. I have not discussed about it. So we have only looked at economic aspects and not, for example, the political and other aspects. And that are some things that we need to work on in future using some suitable methodologies, right? So basically our talk basically covered the economic aspects of data localization regime. I just want to point out some of the work which is in progress, thanks to Sai Rakshit and Professor Shisha Rao, that one of our papers based upon this agent-based modeling is in under review in telecommunications policy. It's also written as one of the chapters. Say, I have to promote this book, right? Data-centric living, algorithms, digitization, regulation. Hope Professor Jaya doesn't mind. This is a new book which is with the publisher Routledge for under review. And there are many people who have contributed. For example, Professor Sachit Rao, Srisha Rao, Jaya, Janaki Srinivasan, Amit Prakash, Srikanth, our PhD students, Deepthi, Arvind Upreti, Ritesh, Rani, so many of them have contributed to this particular volume, and you will see it in print sometime in September. Okay, so that's the end of my talk. Hopefully, that I have conveyed whatever I wanted to convey. Now I'm okay to take questions.
Sridhar, this has been great because there are tons of questions for you to answer.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, Srinath has a comment. So why would we need data localization as long as it's not private data or something that can harm national security?
Correct. So your point is very valid, Vijay. So see, but personal data is very, very, it's very broad, right? It is not just your name and phone number. For example, the browsing history is also your personal data, right? The transactions that you have made is also personal data. And there are a lot of, there is, so if you look at, for example, the thumbs up that you put on Facebook, right? That's a personal data. But if all these data have to be stored within India, then there is strict data localization. So we need to clearly understand what data, personal data, that needs to be stored and not stored, and so on and so on, right? So just even if it is personal data, it can be huge. And it can encompass, for example, the whole our browsing history in the last 1 year. That can be still personal data. Should we want to store it? Should we force it to be stored within India or not? Is a big question. Okay.
So, Srinath has raised his hand. Srinath, you want to say?
Yes, please, Srinath.
Yeah. See, the thing is, the notion of localization is not relegated to data per se, right? I mean, in the sense that international trade or any other kinds of international activities have been happening for a long time, and there have been notions of jurisdictions, right? And so one thing which I've kind of found copious by its absence is the absence of a concept of jurisdiction with data. So jurisdiction is a logical entity. It's not a physical entity, right? And for example, if we have an embassy of a foreign country in our country, it's actually logically their country's land, not our country's. So even if the data physically resides in say Santa Clara or whatever, it could still be jurisdictionally belonging to some other country. So are there any models that that kind of promotes this notion of a jurisdictional entity, a logical jurisdiction rather than a
No,
physical?
absolutely. So, you hit the nail on the wall. So, for example, EU GDPR, right? EU GDPR clearly states what it is applicable, when it is applicable, right? So, for example, as you correctly pointed out, the data that is stored within the EU premise in other countries is subject to EU GDPR. So, for example, the data of the embassy officials, right? Because the embassy is actually EU property, which is located probably in other country, but still the EU GDPR regulations are applicable for those individuals, right? EU GDPR also says that the EU GDPR is applicable for companies which are located within EU or companies which serve residents of EU, irrespective of where they are. Right? So these are logical, these are not physical. For example, if there is a company here in India which handles European data, even though it is not located, this particular country does not have a presence in Europe, still they are bound by GDPR. So this notion is coming up, right? But that is why this strict adequacy rules which have been put into place by GDPR, right? So if, for example, if we have enough data protection regulation, we know that it can be treated on par with EU. So it is coming up, like as you have correctly pointed out, but so it will take a little bit more time in order for this to be agreed upon for all kinds of data.
Okay. Thanks.
I think
Shiva has also raised his hand. Shiva, in 1 second, let me just ask the next question on the chat. Do we have any figures on the extent of digital data that currently exists within national boundaries? From Amit Prakash.
Okay, so I don't have any quantifiable number. For example, I cannot say how much of GB or how much of terabytes it is there, but we all know that since PDP is not effective, it's only the RBI rules which is effective. All the financial transactions, whether you do it through Paytm or NEFT or IMPS, all the financial transactions have to be stored within India and India only according to 2018 regulation. So that is the only concrete thing that we have with respect to data which is locally stored in servers in India. Amit.
Yeah, can I just quickly get a clarification? So what I was coming to was, one is the classification that you had used earlier in terms of restrictive countries and non-restrictive countries based on the policies. So that is more on paper. What would be restrictive and non-restrictive would also show in action by a data like this. If the US, for example, already has 90% of its data within national boundaries, it may not suffer much by putting together a policy which says I'm fine with the data getting located in Bangalore. Whereas India, which has only 10%, will do so. So just trying to understand if something like that exists.
No, you are perfectly correct. I don't have an answer to that, but that's a very, very interesting point. Right? So, for example, I mean, that's probably one of the reasons why you see US not having data regulation, because most of the data exists in the US. Right? Most of the servers are located in the US for US companies as well as foreign companies, and that's why they are not too much worried. Right? You're absolutely, your argument is very valid. That is a thought for us to include it into our research. Absolutely, thank you very much. And Deepak, if it's okay, I'll just handle a couple of questions from Deepak. I was joined from outside. He's a research fellow at IIIT. Can I go ahead?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So that's about the binary model of producers and consumers losing its relevance in the digital ecosystem, the emergence of consumers. So we have not given it a thought. As for example, modelers, we would like to clearly demarcate between what producers do and what consumers do, so that we can analyze the transactions. Right. So we have not given it a thought, Deepak. We might have to look at it again. Any other questions? Sridhar, general question, what about data stored in edge servers? Are they covered also in the scope of data localization? Yes.
Yeah. Shiva's been raising his hand. Can we just take his question? Shiva, Malapaka?
Hello. Uh, I have a small question, or it may be a query. So we were all concerned about the security aspects of Zoom. Although the company is located in US, its servers were in China, right? And it was being held to the Chinese data laws, if I'm not wrong, right? So how do such situations fit into this kind of a research? That was the question.
Sridhar, you can
Yes,
also
yes.
probably take Shantanu's question along with us. He's asked, why is China considering to ease restrictions?
See, it's a news clip, so I really don't have. Can you hear me, Shantanu? Yeah. So I don't have an answer to this particular news question. So probably, the genome sequence that they are doing, they might want to, the whole world to look at it, or for whatever reasons they want to take the data out or bring the data in. So this is a news report which I picked up, but it looks like the conditions like a pandemic will basically drive even China to rethink about their policies and strategies.
Yeah, so Shiva's question on Zoom regarding the servers residing in China and the company itself registered in US.
Shiva, can you, because since I went out, I lost everything on my chat. So can you please ask the question, Shiva?
So my question was, we were all concerned about Zoom, right? That the company is although US, the servers were in China. So the servers were being say subjected to Chinese data laws. So what will happen to such situations in this kind of a research, or
for
any
example,
comment?
Correct. So, we have also written quite a bit about policies. So for example, if you look at Zoom policy, privacy policy, it clearly states that, all the data is located in the US servers, right? And unless the customer asks, we will put it in the US servers. If the customer wants the data to be localized, locally stored, then we would allow them to do that, right? So for example, you can always share, you can always save the, Zoom session locally in your laptop, right? So that option is always there. If you do a cloud storage, it is supposed to be stored in the server in the US, right? But they have violated, left and right their own privacy policy statement. Yes, data localization restrictions will clearly indicate where the data will have to be stored, right? And if, for example, if the data localization regime says that it has to be stored within India, then Zoom has to put in servers here in India and store even the cloud save data in the cloud servers located within India.
Sridhar, Trideep has several questions. Trideep, you just want to ask real quickly? Yeah, go ahead.
Trideep, yes.
Trideep, you can ask.
So Trideep asked a question about edge servers.
Yeah.
No, yeah, so that was one. See, you had on slide 21, Sridhar, you talked about freedom of expression changes because of localization. I was kind of curious. If I was posting today something from an Indian IP to a social network which is residing as anywhere in the world, I'm open to Indian law, right, for the views and posting detail. So how does that change? And the corollary is, if I'm posting something which is, and the servers in Sweden, do I have to be careful about what Sweden thinks about it because the servers there? I mean, how does
Absolutely. For example, absolutely. So, in the absence of personal data protection law in our country, for example, your tweet data or your Facebook data, if it is stored within Sweden, and if the Swedish law enforcement agencies want this particular data to be used for lawful purposes, then they can request Facebook or Twitter to dig it out and give it to them. That is perfectly possible. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was not aware of the second part. I thought only we are responsible to the Indian authorities.
No, because see, unless we have a personal data protection which says that the data which is which is originating from India or from Indian residents should not be given to law enforcement agencies in other countries without Indian government's approval. If that clause is not there, then the other countries can actually swoop in.
So that makes the second question relevant, which if data stored on edge servers, right? I mean, that's how we kind of distribute stuff today. If the data stored there, then I have to be totally aware of the complete storage chain of my post and my transaction.
Correct. So edge servers basically, to some extent, if I'm correct, I mean they are mirrors, right? So the mirror can be for taking, one is from localization regulation compliance, but it can also be for improvement in quality of service and so on. They might cache it locally, the edge service, right? So, but still, they will be subject to data localization regulations.
Thanks, Sridhar.
Aditya Jain has a question. Sir, slide 21, you mentioned surveillance by local government. How much does data localization play into the government's hand, given they can invoke anything in the name of national security?
They can, right? But if the data is located, personal data protection will also require, for example, physical presence of, for example, the intermediaries such as Facebook and Twitter. If they have, if they exceed certain number of consumers, right? The reason is that you can actually go and right? So we can actually go to the physical presence and then arrest the CEO, right? I mean, that is the control that law enforcement officials want to have. But if everything is outside, then it is not possible. It doesn't come under the territorial jurisdiction, and therefore they are at a loss.
Okay. Then the last question is from Vijay Shankar. Sir, if no data is allowed out of the country, personalization of services for users in that country can be achieved only if companies shift there. Is that a feasible way to get foreign companies to invest in the country?
Absolutely. So, so personalization of services will suffer, right? If the data localization, if there is a strict data localization, because you can also profile Indian users, you cannot profile based upon global users, and therefore that is one of the disadvantages. The quality, the personalization quality will deteriorate, right? Even though price may be comparatively cheaper, right? So yes, so that is one of the reasons why global companies do not want a strict form of data localization, because they will not be able to personalize these services and then compete effectively. That's correct.
Shrisha has a comment. There's
also my co-author.
Yeah. Shrisha, you want to talk?
Hi, Jaya. No, so my comment was only about what Tridip was asking, which is what happens if the data is somewhere else and so on. So I think that's an issue of political or legal frameworks, which really isn't something that is consonant with economic frameworks. And also there are examples, well-known examples like Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, who is presently under indictment in the US and who is fighting his deportation to the US. Basically for doing things outside the US where the US thinks he broke their laws, although he was not in the US and he probably did not directly interact with any data source in the US. He did that indirectly according to the Americans, but so anyway, that's a whole other issue that really is not proper localization. It's about criminal penalties or law enforcement and so on, which is, I think, different from the framework here.
Any other questions? Anything else? Everyone? Otherwise, we can just give Sridhar.
Thank you, and
thank you so much, Sridhar.